The snow came early to Calico Basin that November, and it did not come gently. Margaret Holt stood behind the long counter of the trading post that had belonged to her husband for 11 years, and she watched the three men circle her pelts the way wolves circle something they have already decided is theirs. She had laid them out herself that morning before dawn, while the stove was still cold, and her breath made small clouds above the counter. 42 beavers, 19 minks, 7 otters, and a matched pair of silver foxes that Alton had trapped in the high country the autumn before the fever took him. She knew what they were worth. She had kept the books. She had written the letters to the buyers in Denver. She had tallied every column in the ledger that sat in the drawer beneath the register, its pages filled with the handwriting that belonged to Alton right up until March, and then filled with hers. The three men were buyers from St. Louis. That was what they said. They had a wagon and a letter of introduction from a trading house whose name she did not recognize. And they had the particular ease of men who expected to pay less than they offered. The tallest one, Braddock, picked up one of the silver fox pelts and held it toward the window light without asking her permission. The other two watched him and said nothing. He set it back down. What you have here is fair quality. Mid-grade. Wintered late, by the look of the undercoat. Margaret kept her hands flat on the counter. They were taken in October. Prime condition. He smiled at her the way men sometimes smiled when they had already finished the conversation in their own heads. We can do 68 cents the pelt on the beaver, $1.10 on the mink, the otter we will pass on, fox $3 the pair. She had been told to expect weakness. Her brother-in-law had told her, back in September when he came to settle what he called the affairs of Alton, and she called her business. He had told her she would not understand the market. He had told her she should think about selling the post. He had told her a great many things while she stood in her own doorway and listened with her hands folded, the way she had learned to stand when she wanted to appear smaller than she felt. She knew that 68 cents on prime beaver was less than half what Alton had received the previous winter. She knew that $3 on a silver fox was an insult that would have made her husband set the pelt down and show the men the door. She did not show them the door. She was alone. There was still a mortgage on the post, and the payment was due in January, and her nearest neighbor was 4 miles east through snow that was already 8 inches on the level. She took a breath. I will consider your numbers. The men exchanged a look that they did not bother to hide. Braddock set his gloves on the counter. We have one more stop before Reno. We would need an answer today. Mrs. Holt? She was still standing there, saying nothing, when the door opened, and a man she had never seen came in from the cold. He was not a large man, but he filled the doorway for a moment, in the way that people do when they are accustomed to cold weather and not frightened by it. He pulled the door closed behind him with care, so that the wind did not get in. He had a coat that had seen better years, and a hat that was doing its job. He stamped the snow from his boots on the mat she kept there for the purpose, and looked at the room the way a man looks at a room he is trying to understand before he speaks in it. His name, she would learn later, was Callum Reese. He had come to Calico Basin from a mining settlement 2 valleys east, where a claim had played out 6 months before the investors admitted it. He had $60 in a money belt and a letter of reference from a freighting company in Elko, and he had come to the basin because he had heard there was work on the far side of the ridge come spring. He saw the furs laid out on the counter. He saw the 3 men. He saw Margaret. He crossed to the stove and held his hands toward it, because the stove was there and his hands were cold, and that was a natural thing to do. He did not look at the buyers again. Then he spoke, as if to no one in particular, not to her and not to them, but to the room in general, the way a man might comment on the weather. Silver fox taken in October will grade prime every time. I have seen that undercoat before. Denver buyers pay 8.5 the pair, sometimes 9, if you get Carver and Sons on a good week. Nobody moved. He turned to warm the other side of his hands. Braddock straightened. You know the fur trade, do you? I trapped 8 seasons in the Bitterroots. I know what a pelt is worth." The second buyer, a shorter man named Crane, made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Callum looked at him without expression. Then he looked at Margaret, and there was something in the look that was not pity and was not boldness, and was not exactly anything she had a word for. It was closer to acknowledgement, as if he had looked at the counter and at her face and at the ledger drawer, and understood something about the morning she had been having. He turned to her directly. "You have a catalog from Carver and Sons?" "Denver wholesalers. They publish a price sheet in September." She had one. She had 3 of them in the drawer with the ledger. Alton had saved every one. She reached beneath the counter and set the most recent one on the wood between them. Callum turned it to face the buyers without looking at them. He did not say anything else. Braddock picked it up, read it, set it down. The room was quiet except for the stove. Margaret watched Braddock look at Crane. Crane looked at the floor. The third man, whose name she had not caught, had moved a step back from the counter. "We may have some flexibility on the mink," Braddock said finally. She sold them the beaver at $1.14, the mink at $1.70. She kept the otter and the silver fox for a separate buyer, and she told them so in a voice that did not invite discussion. They paid in banknotes. They left before noon. When the door closed behind them, Margaret stood for a moment with both palms on the counter. The room had the particular stillness that comes after something tense has passed. The man called Callum was still at the stove. He seemed to understand that there was no hurry. Without turning, she spoke toward the window. "I knew those prices were wrong. He did not offer, of course you did, or I could tell." He crossed to the counter instead, picked up one of the silver fox pelts still laid out on the wood, and held it toward the window the same way Braddock had, except that his hands were still and he was not performing anything. They count on people not having the sheet in front of them. He set the pelt down. Then he looked at her with a steadiness that had nothing in it of charity. "I will take the fox pair, both of them, $9 even. That is what Carver and Sons will pay you in Denver, and it is what they are worth, and I would rather the money stay in this county than go to St. Louis." She looked at him for a long moment. "You do not have to do that." He pulled the money belt from inside his coat and set it on the counter. "I know I do not have to. I have $60 in here and no immediate need for all of it. And those pelts will grade prime anywhere they go. I am not doing you a favor. I am making a fair purchase." She looked at the fox pelts. She looked at him. Then she reached beneath the counter for the ledger and opened it to a fresh line and wrote the transaction down in her own hand. 2 silver foxes, prime grade, $9 even, paid in full. She tore the carbon sheet from the ledger and set it on the counter between them. He counted out 9 silver dollars from the money belt and set them beside the sheet, one at a time, without hurry. She picked them up, counted them, put them in the register. She turned then and looked at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 40. He had a face that had been outdoors a long time, and eyes that were the particular gray of an overcast sky, and he looked back at her without performing anything. No apology for what he had done, no expectation of gratitude. No flicker of the self-satisfaction she might have expected from a man who had just proven himself useful in front of an audience. He just looked at her the way you look at a person when you are waiting to see what they will do next. "Can I give you something warm before you go on?" He would take coffee, if she had it. She had it. He did not go on that day. The snow that had been falling since morning thickened by early afternoon into something that made the road east impassable until it was cleared, and she told him there was a room above the storeroom that Alton had kept for travelers, and she said it plainly, without embarrassment, because she was a practical woman, and the room was there, and the road was not passable, and that was the sum of the situation. He thanked her and asked what he could do to be useful. She gave him the list of things she had been meaning to ask her brother-in-law to help with, back in September, before the conversation about selling the post had made her not want to ask him for anything. 2 shutters that would not latch properly, a section of stovepipe that needed reseating, a rear step that had developed a sag over the summer. He did all 3 before supper. He did them quietly and competently, without commentary on the work or on the state of the things he was fixing, and when he was done he washed his hands at the pump and asked where she would like him. She set the table for two. It was the first time since March that she had set the table for two. She was aware of that, and she put the awareness somewhere to the side, because it was not useful to her at the moment, and Margaret Holt was, above all other things, a woman who had learned to manage what was useful to her and set aside what was not. They ate elk stew and bread that she had baked 2 days before, and she put the lamp in the center of the table, because the evenings came fast now, and the lamp was where it belonged. He told her about the mind that had played out. He told it straight, without blame and without self-pity, and she found herself listening in the way you listen when someone is being honest without needing you to admire them for it. She told him about the mortgage and the January payment, and the fur buyers who came through twice a year and had, she now understood, been underpaying her since the spring. He nodded slowly, looking at the table. Your husband dealt with them before. He knew the market. He had contacts in Denver. Callum was quiet a moment. You have the catalogs. You have the ledger, I imagine. She had 11 years of ledgers. Then you know what they should have been paying. I knew then. I know now. But knowing and proving are different things when you are standing alone. He did not argue with that. He did not tell her it should not be that way or that things would get better. He nodded once, and there was in that nod a recognition that she had not expected from a stranger, and that settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since March. The lamp made a warm circle on the table between them. She refilled his coffee without asking. He stayed a week. The snow gave him the first 2 days, and then the work gave him the rest. She had not understood, quite, how much had accumulated in the months since Alton. Not the grief, which she had understood perfectly and carried with precision, but the physical weight of the place, the fence line on the north side that had gone to sag, the ice dam forming above the back eave, the inventory she had not had time to count and record since October, because the counting and recording of inventory required both a counter and a recorder, and she had only been one person. Callum Rees turned out to be exactly as useful as he had appeared to be that first morning, which was more useful than most. He was not a talker. He moved through work the way water moves through a channel, finding what needed doing and doing it without requiring direction. She would come around a corner and find him replacing a bolt on a gate latch, or clearing the eave with a long-handled rake he had found in the lean-to, or sitting at the end of the counter with her inventory ledger open and a pencil in his hand, counting tins. She stopped in the doorway the first time she saw him with the ledger. He looked up. I had 8 seasons of keeping count of what I had in the field. I can tally if you want to verify as I go. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she came in, put on her apron, and picked up the second pencil from the tin on the counter. They counted together for 2 hours. They disagreed twice, both times minor, and each time went back to the physical item and found the truth of it. She was right the first time. He was right the second. She made a note of it in the margin for no reason except that it was accurate, and accuracy mattered to her more than anything except honesty, and she was beginning to think those might be the same thing. That evening he sat at the table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him and looked at the lamp for a while. Then he set the cup down and spoke with the particular care of a man who has worked out what he wants to say and wants to get it right. I am going to ask you something, and I want you to tell me plainly if it is too much. She put down the mending she had been doing. What is it? When spring comes and I can get work on the far side of the ridge, that will be seasonal. 3-4 months if the season is good. After that, I will be looking for something that holds through winter. He looked at her. I am not asking for anything you are not in a position to offer. But if you need a hand through the cold months and someone to handle the buyers when they come through, I am steady and I am honest, and I know the fur trade better than they want you to know I do. She sat with that for a moment. The lamp was between them, the same as it had been every evening. What would you want in return? Room and board and a fair wage. Nothing more. She looked at the lamp. There is something I need to tell you, because you would find it out anyway, and I would rather you heard it from me." He waited. "The post is mortgaged. January payment is $240. I have $160 now, and I am counting on the silver fox to make up the difference. If the fox buyer falls through, I am short, and the bank in Reno has already sent one letter." He did not flinch. He did not look at the door. "What does Carver and Sons pay on matched silver fox?" $8.50 to $9, depending on grade. I have a pair in prime condition. Then you will have the $240. She nodded. "I believe so. But I wanted you to know the state of things." He picked up his coffee and found it cold and set it down again. He picked up the cold coffee and set it down again. "I have been in harder situations, and I walked into this one with my eyes open." She believed him on both counts. She wrote to Carver and Sons the next morning and received their reply in 14 days. $9 the pair for the silver fox, which was the high end of the range, and an offer to establish a direct account so that she could bypass the circuit buyers altogether and ship directly to Denver on the twice-monthly freight. She read the letter 3 times at the counter. Then she went to find Callum, who was in the lean-to restacking the split wood into a configuration that would shed water better from the roofline, and she handed him the letter. He read it. He handed it back. He handed the letter back. "That solves January." She folded it. "It does." He went back to the woods. She stood in the doorway of the lean-to with the letter in her hands and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but was adjacent to both and was warmer than either, and she thought that this was what it felt like when something you had been bracing against for months simply lifted. She called his name. He turned. "The wage I can offer is fair, but not generous. Not until spring." He set down a length of wood and looked at her. "Margaret." It was the first time he had used her name. She waited. "I did not come here for generous." She nodded, went back inside, put the letter in the drawer with the ledger. The drawer with the ledger was where she put things that mattered. December came in clean and cold. The post did a steady if modest trade. Travelers passing through on the road to Reno. 2 families from the valley below who came in for supplies before the hard weeks. A pair of trappers from the high country who arrived with a season's worth of beaver and mink and who stood at the counter and looked at the price sheet from Carver and Sons that Margaret had pinned to the board behind the register, and who said without prompting that they had heard she dealt straight. She told them what she could do for them and what she could not. They shook hands across the counter and sold her 20% of the load on the spot, and told her they would be back in February with the rest. Callum had been in the back tallying a shipment of flour that had come in on the morning freight. He came to the doorway when the trappers left, and she was marking the transaction in the ledger, and he leaned on the door frame and watched her. She was aware of him watching. She finished the entry and blotted the page. Word moves fast in a small territory. It always does, especially about who deals straight and who does not. She put the ledger back in the drawer. She had been thinking about something for a week, turning it the way you turn a stone to look at all its sides. She closed the drawer and looked at him. "You came in that morning, and you did not have to say anything." He was quiet for a moment. "No." He looked at the floor, and then at her. "I have thought about why you did." He looked at the floor, and then at her. "I have watched people be taken advantage of because the other person had information they did not. It has happened to me. I do not enjoy watching it happen to someone else." She nodded. "That is an honest answer. I try. I know you do. I can tell." He looked at her in the way he had looked at her that first morning, when she had not had a word for the look. She had been working on finding the word since then, turning it the same way she had turned the question about why he had spoken. The word, she thought, was witness. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you are actually seeing them. Not the shape of them or the use of them, but the person inside the situation. She was not certain she had been looked at that way since Alton. She did not say that. She picked up a pencil from the counter. "I have to write to my brother-in-law." He asked about the post again in his last letter. Callum straightened from the doorframe. What will you tell him? I will tell him the post is not for sale. The letter from her brother-in-law arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. His name was Gerald Tanner, and he had been managing, in his own estimation, the affairs of the Holt post since the spring, which meant he had been arriving at her post uninvited with advice, and leaving with concerns she had not shared. His letter was 3 pages long. The first page was about the mortgage, which he claimed he had heard was in distress. She did not know who had told him this, and she thought she could guess. The second page was about her situation, by which he meant her being alone and a woman, and in the trading business, and he used the word inadvisable twice. The third page was an offer to buy out the post at a price that was, she calculated, somewhat less than the value of the building alone, not counting the stock, the contracts, the established customer relationships, or the 11 years of goodwill that had the trappers from the high country coming back in February. She read it at the kitchen table after supper. Callum was reading by the lamp, a book he had bought from the freight driver for 2 bits, and he looked up once when she set the letter down, and then looked back at his book. Gerald wants to buy the post. He did not look up. He has offered me $900. Callum closed the book on his finger and looked at her. You know what it is worth. I know what the building alone is worth. I do not know the full picture. She set the letter on the table between them. The building is worth $1,200 without the stock. The stock is worth $400 at cost. The Carver account is worth something. The trapper relationships are worth something. 11 years of a reputation for dealing straight is worth something. He was quiet for a moment. So he is offering you less than half. He is counting on me not knowing the difference. He looked at her steadily. But you do know. She set her hands flat on the table, and when she spoke her voice was plain and certain. I have always known. I kept these books for 6 years before Alton trusted me to close transactions on my own. I trained myself to know, because nobody was going to give me the knowing, so I had to take it. She had not said that to anyone. She had thought it many times, in the quiet way you think things that you do not know yet whether they are safe to say out loud. Callum did not look surprised. He did not tell her she should have more confidence or that things were different now. What will you write back? The same thing I told you in November. The post is not for sale. He nodded once and opened his book again. She got up and found the writing paper. Gerald Tanner arrived in person on the 20th of December. She had known he would. He was the kind of man who could not take a written no as a final answer, because written answers could not be softened by the particular look he had, the one that suggested he was being patient with someone who did not understand their own situation. He arrived in a hired buggy from Reno and came into the post in his good coat and looked around the room with the expression of a man who has already decided what he is going to purchase and is simply working out the details. Callum was behind the counter sorting an incoming shipment of dry goods. Gerald looked at him. Then he looked at Margaret. Who is this? Margaret kept her voice even. He works here. Gerald set his hat on the counter. Margaret, I have come a long way to talk sense with you. Then talk sense. I am listening. He talked for a long time. He talked about the mortgage and about the winter and about the isolation and about what a woman in her situation needed and what a woman in her situation could not be expected to manage, and about how Alton would have wanted her to be looked after, and about how the offer of $900 was generous, given the market and given the circumstances, and given. He paused here and looked at Callum again. Everything. Callum did not look up from the dry goods. Margaret listened to all of it. She let him finish. She was patient in the way that she had learned to be patient with people who were going to say what they were going to say regardless of what she did in the meantime. When he finished, she walked to the counter and set both hands on it and looked at him the way she looked at price sheets, without sentiment, finding only what was true. Gerald, I am going to tell you what the post is worth, and then I am going to tell you what I want, and then this conversation will be over. He opened his mouth. She did not pause. The building appraised at $1,200 in the spring of 1884. The stock on hand today is valued at $460 at wholesale cost. I have a direct account with Carver & Sons in Denver established 6 weeks ago, which is worth at least $200 a year in margin I was previously losing to circuit buyers. I have 2 Trapper accounts returning in February with pre-committed inventory. The mortgage payment is covered for January. She set her hands on the counter. I am not selling. Not to you. Not to anyone. The post is mine, and I know what it is worth, and I know what I am doing, and I have known both of those things since before you began arriving with advice I did not request. The room was very quiet. Gerald looked at Callum. Callum set down a tin of baking powder and looked back at him, without expression and without apology. The way a person looks at something that is simply there and needs to be seen clearly. Gerald picked up his hat. And addressed the room rather than her. You will find this harder than you think. Margaret kept her eyes on him. I have already found it very hard. I am still here. He left before noon. The buggy disappeared east on the road toward Reno. Callum came out from behind the counter and stood beside her at the window. He did not say well done or I am proud of you or any of the things that would have made it smaller than it was. You want coffee. She breathed out slowly. I want coffee. He went to make it. She stood at the window a moment longer, watching the road. And what she felt was not triumph and was not relief, but was something steadier than both. It was the particular feeling of a thing that has been uncertain for a long time, becoming, at last, certain. The January payment went to the bank in Reno on the 3rd of the month, carried by the freight driver who had an account there and who charged her $1 for the service, which was reasonable. She wrote the amount in the ledger in her own hand and closed the book and put it in the drawer where it belonged. Spring came late to Calico Basin that year, which is to say it came in April instead of March, which in that country was only a few weeks of difference but felt longer. The snow came off the mountains slowly, and the road east opened up in stages, and one morning she walked out to find the first green at the base of the south facing fence posts. The particular pale green of new grass deciding whether to commit. Callum had said in November that he would go to the ridge work in spring. She had not forgotten. She did not think he had either. She found him that morning in the lean-to, sharpening tools, which was a thing you did when you were preparing to leave and wanted to leave everything in order. She watched him for a moment through the doorway. He looked up. The ridge work will start in 2 or 3 weeks if the road holds. That is what I have heard. She leaned against the doorframe. The lean-to smelled of sharpened iron and pine and the clean cold still coming off the mountains. I wanted to tell you something before then, because I did not say it when I should have, and I do not want to leave it unsaid. He set down the file, gave her his full attention in the way he always did, which was one of the things she had come to count on without quite deciding to. You came in out of the cold that morning, and you said something true in a room where people were counting on me, not knowing the truth. You did not do it to make yourself important, and you did not do it to put me in your debt. You did it because it was the right thing. She stopped and started again. I have been running this post for 9 months alone, and I know it's worth down to $50. I know what I am doing, and I know how to do it. But it is easier to know those things when someone else also knows them. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. Margaret. She waited. I was going to ask you something before I left for the ridge. I have been working out how to ask it since January. Then, ask it. He turned the file over in his hands once and set it down. What I want to know is whether what we have here, the 2 of us at this post, this winter, whether that is something, or whether it is just a practical arrangement that happened to work out well. She considered him. She had been considering him since November, the same slow turning she brought to any question she wanted to understand properly before she answered it. I do not enter into arrangements I do not intend to keep. He was quiet for a moment. That is not quite an answer. No, it is not. She looked at him in the morning light and thought of the lamp on the table between them, night after night, and the drawer with the ledger where she put the things that mattered, and the letter from Carver and Sons folded inside it, and the name Callum in the wage column she had started in December, his handwriting in the margins of the inventory. The bolt he had replaced on the gate latch that had not needed replacing since. Come back from the ridge when the season ends. He held her eyes. I had intended to. Then we will have the rest of the conversation then. He picked up the file again, and the corner of his mouth moved, just once, and she knew what it meant. She went back to the counter. The morning was clear, and the first green was at the base of the fence posts, and the drawer with the ledger was shut in full, and she had a post that was hers, and a payment made, and a spring coming in the way spring comes in the basin, slow and then all at once, and she was ready for it.